Hey everyone! For the background footage, I'm going to be using some Sendoku Major background footage. This is Moonlight versus Zenith's team, Metro, so, we'll get some cool perspective in there. We'll start Wiper this game, but maybe I'll change it around as Omega. Anyway, the actual topic today. So, some discussion I saw briefly on the Sendoku Major was talking about more aggressive comps, or more mobility-focused comps, and why those aren't seeing as much success lately as an alternate style. And I wanted to briefly talk about it. So this would be stuff like ink brush comps or, just generally brush comps, wiper comps, maybe, Tetra, Dually Sculpture, stuff like that. And it's not trying to say that these see no success. Obviously, Dually Sculpture was on second place for this, and there was an ink brush team, and we're watching a wiper right now. So there's a decent bit of it, but in terms of the strat really fully leaning into that mobility playstyle, Hypernova's really the only team trying it right now, and they obviously had a pretty good run in the tournament. They got some good wins, but, they didn't make it to top 4 or anything. So we currently haven't been seeing as much there, and then in Japan, we've seen the occasional ink brush or the occasional wiper, stuff like that, but we haven't really seen any of those do super well. Dually Sculpture hasn't even done as well recently, which has usually been the staple for getting results right now. So, is this just a skill issue? I think there's two factors for this. One is that I think the comps around these weapons aren't as optimal. I'm a little bit biased, obviously, but for example, I think that Wiper is very enabled by something like Tenebrella, mixing into the mobility with tanking, for instance. And there are definitely other ways of going around that in terms of Hypernova's comp. While I do like their comp to some extent, I've critiqued things like having Whale Brush over Hammer Brush, because I believe Hammer is such a very big part into playing into the stalling and threat potential. Or also having things like 96 that I haven't seen as recently, but I think is a good way to play around it, since the, like with Tent, the tanking power of 96's Wall and Kraken is good for stalling. And in particular, Kraken is really good as a way to give recalls in varied locations, while still maintaining aggressive pressure, since obviously the recall is very far away. In terms of Dually Sculpture, in Japan, for instance, that comp initially saw a lot of success when the Dually Sculpture was paired with something like a roller, along with something like a splash. So Dually Sculpture would function a lot as bait for other weapons, and recently I don't think any of the Dually Sculpture comps I've been seeing really lean into that as much. I think that Milky Way's comp of running it alongside Splash and Bucket was probably the closest to it, but I think Roller or maybe even Mint the Cavitator fare much better, since these can basically be instant kill weapons with good sharking and reliability. So I think that is a, I think that is a fair reason to say that the comps being ran are technically a little less optimal than ones we've seen earlier, and that is part of the reason. But I think a different part of it is looking at the actual meta comps themselves. Unfortunately, this lobby isn't really a great example of this, because both teams are running a bit of off meta here, even if only a little bit for something like Metro. And that idea would be, what has become a staple of normal comps, and what can honestly be a big part of its own discussion here, is Burst Bomb being very prevalent in comps. We have things like Splash-O-Matic, Platana Stamper, S-Blast, even occasionally things like Vimy can sub in. And what does that mean? That means that there's a lot more insta-kill combos that are easier to set up. It's a lot more likely that you'll get hit by Burst Bomb plus some 70 hit, Burst Bomb plus a pen hit, something like that. And because those burst kill options are increasing, it's a lot easier to deal with mobility comps. Going for things like burst combos is something that are very good for it. In addition to that, the rise of stuff like S-Blast and Slosher getting more popular recently also have options to deal with it. Compared to most blasters, S-Blast short-range mode gives a direct answer to mobility-focused comps, and if anything, Booyah Bomb and Burst are also pretty good at helping with that. Slosher, on the other hand, is, with the arcing 70 hit, is already usually pretty good at it, even if the kit is less of a factor. So there's a lot more comps right now that are capable of dealing with it, and mainly, what this means for higher level of play is these kind of comps have to take a little bit more caution than they do normally, because now there's a much more likelihood of a chance that they're going to run into a situation where they can be quickly bursted down, compared to previous metas where they could potentially more often than not find weapons that, don't have the way of dealing with them very well. One matchup in the Sendoku Major that I want to point out here would be Moonlight versus Hypernova, where they got 0-3. And I feel like a big part of the dynamic between these two teams is that Moonlight doesn't really have any fast burst option outside of the, occasional S-Blast they run. Tent is much slower and requires you to be at close range, and Wiper and Mint don't really have as many burst options. It leaves pretty much just the S-Blast, and even then you have to be at close range in order to deal with that. And since S-Blast doesn't have a lot of burst bomb options to combo off of it, it doesn't really have as much synergy as traditional meta comps. Compare that with a team like Healthy Diet Food Groups that has a lot more fighting power due to dropping the cooler, and therefore having more stability specials to stay alive from dives from things like Crab Tank or a Big Bubbler being added to it, or as well as just having an option like Bamboo that'll be less susceptible to dives than Pen, and the matchup can be a lot more volatile. I want to clarify, by no means am I implying that the comps dictated the matchup or anything. But I do want to note that, in general, I think that mobility comps have more volatile matchups. They require more adaptions. This applies to Moonlight as well, right? Moonlight doesn't have a full-on mobility comp, but they play a little bit around a similar deal with tanking mixed with Wiper's mobility. And because of that, a lot of similar things they have to deal with. Moonlight got counterpicked a lot by double strike comps. So even if they don't have to deal with meta comps, the matchups that they have to deal with can very much dictate how the team has to play and change it. What this means is mobility comps like the one Hypernova runs are harder. You have to deal with harsher counterplay. You're more likely to run into that counterplay because it's a main part of the meta, and so because of that, you have a lot more work you have to put in, thus the comp is harder. The weapons you pick need to be more specific. Your playstyle needs to be, more fully leaned into. It's very difficult to specialize in that. I am very hopeful to see what teams like Hypernova will do with it long term, but I think that's ultimately been the struggle. And even teams that partially lean into the mobility, like teams that run a Wiper or a Brush, or even, again, comps like Moonlight, will have to play a factor in that. Outside of that, I think that there's one more point that I don't want to talk about too much because it's been said to death, but it's worth noting in all of these kind of discussions about the game's problems. This is usually also a viable answer, and that is the map design. A lot of what dive comps are very good at is taking space quickly and utilizing a variety of angles, because the mobility of these weapons allows them to get access to these angles. As you might imagine, the less angles a map has access to, the less often these comps can be spread out, the harder it is to take advantage of their strengths. When you have to brute force up this ramp, for instance, there's only so much that a Wiper's mobility is going to help, whereas by comparison, all the clumped up enemies are great for the sheer amount of burst bombs. This doesn't mean I think Burst or the meta comps are overtuned, by the way. Burst is very much a factor of being more common because we've lowered main weapon power, and I think instead the answer needs to be buffing these mobility options or giving them better ways of dealing with it, like Brush's Hammer Throw, or buffing stuff like Dually Squelcher's specials. Anyway, that's about it. I hope this discussion was helpful on why this hasn't been, around as much, and hopefully things shift.